Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this first edition of PTMC Talks. Portugal Medical Cannabis aims to bring together the health community, not only in Portugal but around the world. We want to bring together doctors, patients, nurses, pharmacists, the industry of medical cannabis, and the general public so they can have more information and more education on medicinal cannabis. This talk will be held in English. We will have Dr. Sandra Carrillo from Colombia and Dr. Mauro Lins from Brazil. But first, and as a brief introduction, we will have a testimony from a patient in Portugal. I am here with Isabel Beja, and Isabel is the mother of Nono. She is 3 years old and she has a West syndrome, which is a rare form of epilepsy. So I am going to talk with Isabel in Portuguese, but after that the event will be held in English. Boa tarde, Isabel.
Olá, Laura.
Muito obrigada por ter vindo. Nós gostávamos de lhe perguntar e de saber um bocadinho da sua experiência com a epilepsia, com a Nono. Como é que era a Nono antes de começar a tomar o CBD e como é que a Nono está hoje?
Então, a Nono, antes de tomar o CBD, fazia os anticonvulsionantes habituais para este tipo de situação, para estas epilepsias, anticonvulsionantes que têm efeitos nefastos no seu desenvolvimento. Quando descobri o CBD e decidi iniciar este caminho da cannabis medicinal, a Nono deixa de ser a boneca de trapos, sem expressão, sem movimento, e passou a ser uma menina mais presente, mais real, uma menina com sorriso, com olhar, porque o CBD permitiu-me retirar aos poucos doses elevadíssimas de medicação que têm efeitos muito graves, não é, no seu desenvolvimento. Hipotonia, apatia, uma série de situações que os medicamentos da epilepsia têm como efeitos secundários.
Como é que foi da primeira vez que quis tentar arranjar o CBD? Como é que fez para obter o CBD?
Quando eu decidi iniciar o CBD em Portugal ainda era muito um tabu, como ainda é, infelizmente, mas ainda mais, não se ouvia falar do CBD. Eu tinha lido muito artigos sobre o CBD e sabia da eficácia dele noutros países, que já se era utilizado há bastante tempo, e decidi contactar os Estados Unidos, a Califórnia, mais precisamente. Um médico na altura estava disponível para me ajudar. Iniciámos então uma consulta online, logo de seguida enviaram-nos a primeira seringa de CBD e logo aí deparámos com um grande problema, porque o CBD não passava na alfândega aqui em Portugal, por ser uma substância ilícita, não estar legalizado cá, não ser considerado um medicamento, e é a partir daí que surgem os primeiros problemas. Nós começámos a falar com a Califórnia e a perceber qual seria a melhor estratégia, porque precisávamos muito do CBD, e é quando nos dão como solução o envio do CBD dentro de bonecos de peluche. No fundo, enganar a alfândega de uma forma ilegal, é verdade, mas muito acima daquilo que qualquer lei possa permitir, que é a força da mãe ou a tentativa de melhorar de uma criança, e esta foi a solução que a Califórnia nos apresentou, ao qual nós aceitámos de imediato, e assim passaram a vir as seringas de CBD.
Uma mãe é capaz de qualquer coisa pela saúde do seu filho?
Sim. Sim. A saúde dos nossos... Ou melhor, nem a saúde, os nossos filhos estão acima, pelo menos do meu ver, acima de qualquer coisa, acima de mim. Não é? Por isso, nenhuma alfândega me podia
bloquear o acesso. E como é que foi a reação dos médicos quando os confrontou com dar cannabis à sua filha?
Então, quando eu entro no gabinete numa das consultas e explico ao médico, na altura seguia a Nono, que queria iniciar este caminho, a abordagem foi completamente distorcida, porque aquilo que ele assumiu é que eu estaria a dar algo ilícito e perigoso à minha bebé, quando tínhamos na farmácia coisas tão mais testadas, tão mais estão melhores, não é, para a epilepsia do que o CBD. Mostrou-se totalmente relutante sobre isto e não quis aceitar esta opção como tratamento. Está no direito dele, obviamente. Eu ouvi-o atenciosamente, não respeitei a opinião dele e por isso trocámos de médico.
E esta nova médica é mais aberta a esta terapia?
Esta nova médica que está com a Leonor entra na nossa vida a já saber que a Leonor faz cannabis medicinal e decide dizer-me que a mãe é que sabe, eu não me oponho, mas também não tenho nada para lhe acrescentar sobre este tema. Não há evidências, eu não sei muito sobre o assunto, por isso este assunto passa a ser da mãe e não meu, ainda que com o meu conhecimento, mas sem grande ajuda da minha parte.
Acha que os médicos também ainda têm alguma falta de informação nesta área?
Eu acho que os médicos têm ainda muita informação nesta área. Sinceramente, Laura, eu acho que neste momento as mães têm muito mais informação do que propriamente os médicos. Não é? As mães leem muito mais e investigam muito mais. Porque é-lhes obrigada a ser assim, não é?
Diretamente implicadas na situação.
Sem dúvida, o objetivo, sem dúvida. Neste momento, os médicos, poucos, têm alguma informação do que lhes chega, mas o que me parece é que têm muito atrito a aceitar as evidências, a aceitar a efetiva melhora das crianças sobre a substância da cannabis.
Então ainda há alguma resistência.
Sem dúvida, sim.
O que é que gostaria, para finalizar, de dizer às instituições responsáveis em Portugal? O que é que poderia melhorar na sua vida neste momento? O que é que gostaria de apelar?
Apesar da cannabis medicinal já ser legal em Portugal, a verdade é que não existe. Não existe. Nós não temos como chegar até ela. A cannabis que a Nuno hoje faz vem de Espanha, de uma forma muito mais fácil e mais ágil de chegar, mas ainda assim difícil.
E ilegal ainda.
Ilegal, sim. O que eu achava que era importante as autoridades do nosso país ligadas à saúde perceberem, bem como todos os médicos e todas as pessoas que estão associadas a isto, é de que acho que há uma frase muito importante que se pode dizer, que é: o essencial é invisível aos olhos. E olharem menos para a planta e olharem mais para o sorriso de quem toma cannabis, de quem percebe e de quem sente o que a cannabis pode fazer. Porque a cannabis não é só uma erva, a cannabis não é só um estupefaciente, a cannabis não é só erro. A cannabis é muito para além disso.
E tem também muito potencial medicinal.
Tem muito potencial.
E a Nono é a prova disso.
É a prova disso, sim.
Muito obrigada, Isabel, por
obrigada
ter estado hoje
Laura.
Connosco.
Sim, sempre que for preciso.
Então, muito obrigada e até breve.
Obrigada.
So that was Isabel sharing with us her experience with cannabis in treating her daughter's West syndrome, a rare form of epilepsy, and how she improved with the CBD oil. So now I will to introduce you to Dr. Sandra Carrillo, and she will talk a little bit more about epilepsy and her experience treating children with this disease. Dr. Sandra Carrillo is a medical doctor from Colombia. She is the president of the Colombia Medical Cannabis Association. She is also a clinical professor at the University of Panama, and she's a member of several international associations. So to talk more about epilepsy, please welcome Dr. Sandra Carrillo. She will be live now from Colombia.
Hi, hello. I'm really
again.
sorry. For the technical issues. These moments looks like everybody's connected to the internet, but well, we are back. I'm going to talk about cannabinoids and epilepsy. A little bit about me. Laura already presented me. I am a professor of the Faculty of Medicine of University of Panama, in charge of medical cannabis scientific program. I am the president of the Colombian Medical Association of Medical Cannabis. And I do enjoy being part of these webinars and teaching, since education is so important in these moments and for the medical community. we're going to talk about cannabinoids and epilepsy. We know that cannabinoids are being used for centuries in treatment of the epilepsy. We have the Arab Al-Majusi describe the anticonvulsant effect after nasal application of extracts from cannabis sativa leaves. We also know about the Persian doctor al-Badri in the century 515 before Christ, using cannabis also too for epilepsy. We have some learning objectives for this lecture. It will be to review preclinical data, clinical data, and benefits and adverse effects of cannabinoids in epilepsy. As you all know, epilepsy, the treatment is still very challenging. Despite the introduction of new anti-epileptic medicines every year, we still have approximately 30% of the patients who are resistant to the treatment. Epilepsy is one of the most common neurological conditions affecting 50 million people globally. This is a big number. There is a lot of medications in the market for epilepsy. We have all these big lists. And we know the endocannabinoid system acts in a very important manner in our body. The endocannabinoid system is one of the largest systems in the body. We have the receptors CB1, CB2. I'm going to give you like a little briefing about that. We have the endocannabinoids, they are the anandamide and the 2-HG. They interact with these receptors. And we have a big amount of CB1 receptors in the brain and the central nervous system. And the CB2 receptors are mostly in the peripheral organs. The endocannabinoid system is responsible for very important functions like appetite, sleeping, mood, and memory. THC is a partial agonist of CB1 and CB2 receptor. And CBD have a very wide variety of actions in different receptors and protein, calcium channels, and also has an allosteric modulation in the opioid receptors, acts also at the dopamine receptor and GABA and glutamate systems. So we have the interaction of CBD in different levels, which is very important to have in consideration when we are using cannabinoids. We have the targets for CBD, enzymes, transporters, ion channels, and receptors. The CB1 receptor plays a central role in the brain development and synaptic plasticity. That's what is important, the application of this science in the epilepsy. This receptor is having a very important expression in the areas that are directly related with cognition and mood. These areas, as we see here in the figure, are the cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. The dysfunction of the endocannabinoid system is related with the etiology of different pathologies. The use of exogenous cannabinoids, like the phytocannabinoids, are responsible for neuromodulation of GABA, glutamate, serotonin, and dopamine, and also increase the anandamide. We have the THC and CBD with all their properties that we see. They have analgesic, antibacterial, antiproliferative, anti-epileptic. We know cannabidiol is second more prevalent phytocannabinoid after THC and is principal non-psychotropic cannabinoid. Most attractive cannabinoid for medical purposes due to his broad potential medical use and the lack of significant side effects. This is something very important because, as we know, cannabidiol is a very noble molecule and lacks the toxicity hasn't been demonstrated yet. It has very reliable anticonvulsant effect. It has poor affinity to the CB1 receptor in contrast to the THC. This is a very important fact that we have to consider. The CBD affects the significant number of targets, including the ion channels, receptors, and enzymes. And some studies have shown that CBD has an anti-epileptic action is attributed to the inhibition of the excitatory glutamatergic neurotransmission. So we've seen here how CBD is working. Another of its possible mechanism is the low affinity for the receptor CB1 and CB2, and is the ability to interfere in the activity of the FAH. This FAH is responsible for the degradation of anandamide, and it potentiates the neurotransmission of endocannabinoids. Several trials in vitro and in vivo in animal models demonstrate the anticonvulsant effect of CBD. Otherwise, THC is responsible for many of the pharmacological effects of cannabis, including the psychoactive effects. We have in here, in this graphic, another effects of THC. THC also has psychoactive properties as a partial agonist of CB1 and CB2 receptors, and has also the ability to stimulate and inhibit the secretion of neurotransmitters. It's also demonstrated to be present in different situations, anticonvulsant effect, although there is some studies that have been released where shows that high amounts of THC can have the opposite effect and cause proconvulsant effects. That's why we have to be careful with THC when we're talking about epilepsy. We have the pharmacokinetics and metabolism of CBD and THC, and we see that both of them, they are primary metabolism with cytochromes. Genetic polymorphisms can affect these cytochromes, the 2C9, the 2C19, and 2DC. So it's very important to check for these interactions, since we see that medications have to go through the first phase metabolism through the liver, and this will impair or increase the absorption of the cannabinoids. The physiopathology of epilepsy, during the epileptogenic process, GABA activity decreases. GABA, as you know, is a neurotransmitter responsible for the inhibition on the postsynaptical neuronal activity in homeostatic conditions. The alterations on the inhibitory systems are responsible for the beginning of the epileptic crisis. We see here the CB1 receptor at molecular level. This is a brief graphic. I'm going to go through this fast. The presence of CB1 receptor in the hippocampus and cortex explains the effects of cannabinoids on memory and learning, and also explains the anticonvulsant properties. The increased density of CB1 receptors in the cerebral cortex, basal ganglia, hippocampus, and the cerebellum are associated with the impact of the cannabinoids in seizure threshold, and also responsible for the side effects related to memory process and cognition. The CB1 receptor in epilepsy, it can affect, triggers epileptiform discharges in the electroencephalogram, causing the development of the status epilepticus. The activation of one receptor produces the detention of the epileptiform activity, demonstrating evidence of the agonist anticonvulsant effect. We see here the CB2 receptor at molecular level, the way they act in a different manner. And we can know that how is the endocannabinoid system implicated in regulation, duration, and frequency of the epileptic crisis due to the role of the endocannabinoids in the modulation of neuronal excitability. Now we're going to go through some in vitro studies. We will see here, this is a study that they were taking hippocampal neuron cultures, low in magnesium, and they were using the Win55, that is a cannabimimetic substance. And the result of this study showed that the properties of the Win55, they were blocked by the receptor-dependent pathway. So in here, we demonstrate the effectivity of the Win55 as a receptor CB1 agonist, proving as anticonvulsant properties. The expression of CB1 receptor was significantly increased, even 183% in the regions of the epileptic hippocampus demonstrated in these cultures that we see. So we see that the extended neuronal depolarization of an epileptiform discharge might cause a switch from suppression of GABA release to suppression of glutamate release. So we see in here the ethiopathology of epilepsy, how it's being produced. Another study was showing that the endocannabinoids like 2-AG and anandamide in dose-dependent manner are effective inhibitors of refractory status epileptic in low magnesium hippocampal neuronal culture models. This preclinical trial design, they were given to the mice, pilocarpine and penicillin to induce seizure development. But before they were giving CBD pre-treatment to the mice, and they proved that protect the mice against the development of the seizures. We have another in vitro and in vivo studies in here proving the efficacy of CBD as an anticonvulsant in animals, reducing the seizure frequency. And we were evaluating also the safety of this for animal models. We see in here how in this situation, CBD is neuroprotector for the brain. More animal studies were shown that THC and other molecules like CBDV and THCV also shown anticonvulsant properties in animal models. And right now, there are ongoing studies studying these other cannabinoids that I'm sure that in the future will show a very important therapeutic value. We know Epidiolex have conducted different trials. Among those trials, they did also preclinical. And the preclinical trial, they showed the CBD significantly attenuated status epilepticus like epileptiform local field potential. They showed seizure reduction in all vivo models, and they showed that there were no motor deficit or neurotoxicity. Again, talking in here about the safety profile of the CBD on animal models. This is another study that we're doing electroshock, audiogenic seizures, and PTZ, pilocarpine, and penicillin for inducing seizures in animal models. And they showed that they was very well tolerated and did not produce motor deficit or neurotoxicity. This is a book that we all may be familiar with. This was a book that was released in 2017 by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and it's a compendium of around 20,000 reviews. They choose the important pathologies that are being treated with medical cannabis, and they divide it in different evidence level. We have conclusive of substantial evidence of effect, moderate evidence of effect, limited, and no evidence. So we see here the conclusive of substantial evidence of effect. We have in pediatric treatment-resistant epilepsy. That is the topic that we are all interested today. We see in here that even that this book was released in 2017, since 1987, Professor Meshulan and Carlini started doing studies with patients in epilepsy. They have a randomized and blinded controlled study with 9 adults. It was a small population, but they were showing that 200 milligrams per day for 3 months, they show no toxicity in these patients, and the patients improve. We have another study at 1980 and 1990 with different randomized and blind and different types of levels of evidence. So these are very old studies, but I put this slide because I want you to see the epilepsy and cannabinoids is being studied for a long time. This is a very interesting study. This study was conducted in in a hospital in Slovenia, in Ljubljana, at the Children's Hospital. It was a very important study because they were giving to the patients CBD, a dose increased until 8 milligrams per kilogram per day. There were a population of 66 patients, and they were proved that in this study, these patients, 48% of them improved more than 50% of the amount of seizures. These patients were all pharmacoresistant epilepsy. This is very important because the indication right now for the treatment of patients with cannabinoids is for pharmacoresistant patients. There are patients that are already in 2, 3, or 4 medications and nothing works for them. So cannabis is a very, very important alternative for them. So in this study, they showed the reduced seizure burden, and they're actually very important to know that in patients that have Dravet, the seizures impairs also cognition and behavior and motor function. So that this is the reason why it's so important when you control seizures in these patients that haven't been able to find appropriate treatment or effective treatment. This study showed too that 22% of the patients didn't have any effect, but it's a very encouraging study because it showed them 48% of the patients improved. And also a very important thing is the measurement of the quality of life that most of the patients referred in these studies. This is another study that it was made in Canada at the Children's Hospital in Toronto. This was a study made with 20 patients, and they were using a preparation of CBD THC cannabis in patients with Dravet syndrome. They were using a preparation that it was a 50-to-1, corresponding to 100 milligrams per milliliter of CBD and 2 milligrams per milliliter of THC. This study is a prospective open label trial, and it was made in patients with Dravet syndrome. So the primary objective of this study was to establish the dosing and the tolerability, and the second objective was to measure the QOL, the quality of living, and also the impact of seizures on the electroencephalogram. They started with doses of 2 milligrams to up to 16 milligrams per kilogram of CBD, and they went from 0.04 THC until 0.3 milligrams per kilogram of THC. So they were using a dose that they showed that it was very safe and tolerable for these patients. The adverse effects that we saw in this study was somnolence, diarrhea, and anorexia. In this study, some patients presented some abnormalities in the transaminases and platelets, but they were related with the use of valproic acid. And in the study, they shown that it was for the first 8 weeks when they were starting the titration. And after 8 weeks, these elevations of transaminases started decreasing. So in this study, they proved that this combination CBD-THC was safe and well tolerated, and it was a very good study that is providing more evidence. Now we have this very famous study that is the study with JW. And in this study, it was made by Davinsky et al. The objective of this study was to measure the seizures frequency. And the secondary objective was the QOL, that is the quality of living. This was a double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized study, and they were using cannabidiol isolate up to 20 milligrams per kilogram per day. And they showed the reduction of the frequencies of seizures per month. And they showed that the seizures reduced from 12 to 5 with CBD. It means like were more than a half. And from 40 to 40.9 to 14 0.1 with placebo. So we see definitely that the CBD has a very important impact. 40% of the patients obtained 50% of reduction of the seizures in this study. Just 5% of these patients became seizure-free. And with the placebo, 0% became seizure-free. So one of the adverse effects that they showed in this study was the diarrhea, vomiting, fatigue, anorexia, somnolence, and some abnormalities at the liver levels. And usually they was related with the patients that they were taking valproic acid, and they proved that the elevation was transient. Most of the patients, they withdraw the treatment for these elevations compared with the ones who didn't withdraw the patient. The elevation disappeared after a while. So in this study, definitely they proved safety and efficacy of cannabidiol. We have more studies in here, double-blind randomized placebo-controlled, made by JW, and they keep doing more studies to demonstrate in bigger groups that cannabidiol is a safe treatment. We have also a review in here when they were seeing how it was working to use other preparations with THC, CBD, and another cannabinoids in different combinations, compared with just the isolate. So we have different results in here. And Epidiolex has results in 3 months with the use of the purified 98% oil-based CBD extract. They were starting a composition with 5 milligrams a kilogram, and they showed 39% of the patients, the reduction was more than 50%. So we still see more important evidence. It's very important to notice that CBD is extensively metabolized by the liver, by the cytochrome. So we have in here the possible interactions that we have, and the publicity that Epidiolex has. The thing with Epidiolex is we live, particularly in my case, in the Latin American community, the resources are not too high, and the cost of Epidiolex is very expensive. That is why it's so important to have more testing and more trials with other type of preparations that can be more affordable for patients. As you may know, Epidiolex is being approved by FDA specifically for the treatment of seizures associated with Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome. In here, we have interactions and with the liver transaminases with Epidiolex. So we have to check always the patient's the liver profile, and be aware that the interactions with valproate and clobazam, in these patients that the Epidiolex study did, they were showing a lot of somnolence, and some of the patients withdrew from the treatments from the somnolence, but it was related for the high levels of clobazam. So usually when a patient starts clobazam and CBD treatment, it's important to reduce the doses of clobazam. So be aware of that specific interaction. In this study, the recommended initial dose, as I said, it was 5 milligrams per kilogram a day, and was increased even to 10 milligrams per kilogram a day. So different doses is being studied. They even went to up 20 milligrams per kilogram a day. In the adverse effects occurring in 10% or more, we have somnolence, diarrhea, fatigue, vomiting, rash, insomnia, and a big list that the patients have to mind when they are starting a treatment. In here, we have a very interesting study. This was like a survey more than another type of study when they were asking the families of the patients how the treatments of epilepsy were working for them. And in here, 33% of the patients were reported to be responders to the oral cannabis extracts. The 30% of the electroencephalograms prior to the after initiating the treatments improved after using the preparations. And adverse effects were reported by 44% of the families. Just 15% of them, they discontinued the treatment. Very important with epilepsy and cannabinoids is the quality of life of the patients, of the family. We can see in this study, they report improvements, included behavior, alertness, language, and motor skills. It's not just about the amount of reduction of the seizures, it's also about the quality of life. We have in here another important study that it was made in different states of the United States, reporting the use of CBD-enriched artisan formulas and the addition of THC and THCA for seizure prevention. But it's a very mixed results, what we have in here. In resume, what we find is that some of these artisan preparations are not correctly labeled. So it's very important right now. I understand there's a lot of families that are desperate for get treatments to their children, but standardization has to be in consideration right now. We have the different levels of scientific evidence, but these artisanal preparations in just studies that they did in the United States and in even another study in Australia, they were showing that these preparations were under-labeled and mislabeled. So they were claiming to have concentrations of CBD that when they did the testing to that preparation, instead of CBD, had higher concentrations of THC. And a different way, they were claiming to have THC and having different concentrations. So we have to be very careful in this because we need to try to have more standardized products or safe products for the patients available. And our recommendation for the families is they have to look for the doctors to prescribe these type of treatments because the doctor will know which treatment has the proper testing and which treatment is safe for the use of the patients and more in a population that we're talking here like children. So it has to be very well tested and this cannabis has to be free of pesticides, of microbial, of a lot of compounds that if it's not a product with a proper standardization or good practices can affect the patients. And this is a review that it was done by this journal in Israel. Very interesting review where they were basically showing the use of pure CBD from Epidiolex to all different preparations. And they even show something very important that is what we were talking earlier about the entourage effect. Unfortunately, there is not a lot of research of entourage effect, but when we do these surveys and reports of families talking about the effects of the children when they're using the whole plant extract rich in CBD, we see that they have to use less amounts of cannabinoids, less amounts of CBD specifically, because when they're using CBD-rich preparations of full spectrum, they have the entourage effect, which allows them to have very good outcomes without having to reach high doses, different with the CBD isolates, they have to give to the patient very high doses in order to achieve the desired effect of reduction of convulsions. And also tied up to that, higher doses of CBD are related with more interaction with the liver enzymes. So it's something that we all should consider at the moment that we are prescribing or deciding what treatments are we going to give to the patient. And as I was talking to you, we have different type of interaction. Important one, as I talk about clobazam, because the patient can have different adverse reactions. As I showed you before, THC is broken down with the cytochromes, and CBD is metabolized by these other enzymes too. Very important also to see the substances that might affect cannabis bioavailability. In here we have a list of different medications, and also cannabis affect the bioavailability of other substances, where we hear here in the list the substances that are increased by CBD. We have the clobazam in the list. And we have to assess the risk, high risk of side effects with the different combinations of these medications in patients. In this case, we see in here anti-epileptics with cannabis. It can cause some sedation, but we can work this out, balancing the doses of the other anti-epileptics. So it has to be something that has to be very well monitored by the neurologist or the doctor who's monitoring and treating the patient. We have another novel cannabinoids like CBDV is being studied right now. We have in vitro and vivo models supporting the capacity of the CBDV with the anti-convulsivant properties, and we have GW currently having investigations in the potential therapeutic application in a dosage range of 400, 800 milligrams daily. We have in here the release of the American Epilepsy Society, the position they have on medical cannabis. I'm going to read it, the text. The recent anecdotal reports of positive effect of cannabidiol for some individuals with treatment-resistant epilepsy give reason for hope. We must remember that these are only anecdotal reports, and robust evidence scientific for the use of cannabis is lacking. The lack of information does not mean that cannabis is ineffective for epilepsy. It merely means that we don't know if cannabis is a safe and effective treatment for epilepsy, which is why it should be studied using the well-founded research methods that we all use for effective treatment in epilepsy have undergone. This is their statement, but in my personal view, and I share this view with other colleagues, and I just showed you that we have a lot of scientific evidence. We have double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled studies. They are a gold standard of the studies and research. So we have a lot of studies. It doesn't mean that we need more studies, but I do think we have a lot of evidence with cannabinoids, medical cannabis, and epilepsy. Either way, I encourage our scientists to keep doing research on the discovery of other cannabinoids helping to improve the quality of life and the response of these patients. So we have here the conclusions. And I think this is something that as physicians and scientists, we still need to assess. Nothing in life should be feared, only understood. Now is the time to understand more, to fear less. I say this because a lot of my colleagues, they are afraid to use medical cannabis because of the stigma, because of the lack of knowledge. But the good news is there initiatives like this initiative of Portugal Medical Cannabis in Europe and in the States, in Latin America. All the communities of physicians, we are trying to share knowledge all over and create an educational program so the physicians and the healthcare practitioners can be more informed, more trained, so they will not be afraid or they will not fear the use of medical cannabis, because when you use it in a proper manner and when the patient can come to the doctor and have a proper treatment, the results are much better than when a patient is just trying to figure it out by itself how to use medical cannabis. So I encourage to all the scientific community and more the doctors to have a more wide perspective about medical cannabis, because these spaces are very important for me, because we have the opportunity to show that there is scientific evidence behind medical cannabis. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if anybody has some questions.
It was a great lecture, Sandra. Thank you so much for your presentation. And now we think it went really well without any cuts, and your internet could stand all the time.
Yeah, I'm really sorry for those technical problems.
No, it's okay. It's happening all over the world, as we know, with internet. Everyone is having problems sometimes, so I hope everyone will understand. Okay, I have a question. We had Isabel Beja, the mother of Nono. She has West syndrome, and she asks if you have any experience with West syndrome, and what are the evidence with CBD on West syndrome?
Well, specifically scientific evidence written, like what I just showed you from journals in West syndrome particularly, I'm not aware of, but I've seen, I am aware of cases of patients with West syndrome that they've been treated with medical cannabis and they have a very good results. The important thing in here is, important thing, and I always encourage the patients, is to keep the monitorization with their doctor, because this treatment, medical cannabis, has to be prescribed and recommended by a doctor, because just the doctor will know about interactions. Earlier, I was showing that there is a lot of interactions with different medications. The patients with epilepsy, one of them is patients with West syndrome, Lennox, Dravet, they have to take another medications, and the interactions have to be monitored. It doesn't mean they cannot use the medical cannabis concomitant, but I've seen in different cases, patients with West, the benefit from the medical cannabis, but with other therapies or among other treatments, and they have to be closely monitored by the doctor. Very important.
She also asks, Sandra, if CBD can lose efficacy if taken in simultaneously with other medications.
No, I'm not aware, and I haven't heard about that, because usually the good thing about CBD is because it's such a noble molecule, can be combined with other medications. And as I said before, it's very important to monitorize in cases, let's say with clobazam or with other treatments like phenytoin or carbamazepine or valproic acid. You have to monitorize the liver and the reactions, because sometimes potentiates or decreases the effect, but is not inhibited by other medications. You just have to be aware of the proper doses and monitorization for the patient.
Okay, thank you, Sandra. We have another question from Luis. He asks if, given the electric shock protocol induce epileptic attacks on mice, is curious if people are more susceptible to epilepsy in heavily electrified environments. What do you think?
Well, I am not aware about that right now because this was in mice models and animal models. So it's hard to know how that affects. Maybe will be a good question to evaluate for the future study.
We have one more question from Maria. She asks if in a young child taking CBD or cannabis, can it have any effect, a side effect at the long term on a cognitive level?
Well, actually, in this last study that I showed of the Maimonides Journal in Israel, they did this review. They were reporting that for epilepsy is safer to use CBD enriched formulations, and in most of these studies they were showing formulations 20-1, 20 CBD, 1 THC, very little amount of THC, because still they have to be determined the effects on the THC. But in some studies they could suggest that very high concentrations of THC could affect the long-term memory, but still that has to be determined. So for children, I think it's safe to use CBD-enriched formulations. And when the moment comes that the patient needs to use some THC, there is some percentage, low percentage, they will show a safest profile for the patient. So you have to monitorize it according to the type of epilepsy, but always start with the CBD-rich preparations that the patients react and respond very well with very minimum side effects.
Okay, and another question not identified is that if taking CBD can cause involuntary movements.
No, it's the opposite. Even can help with the involuntary movements. So there is studies that the CBD helps with the involuntary movements.
And can CBD increase seizures in some times? It's another doubt they are sending us here.
CBD hasn't been proved to increase seizures. The studies that have been shown is THC can have the pro-convulsant effect. No studies that I am aware yet showing CBD being pro-convulsant. A few studies showing THC could be pro-convulsant, but there's not a lot of reports.
What do you think about the difference of the full spectrum oils and the isolated CBD as it is in IPDLX, for instance?
Well, that's a very good question, Laura. I may have a bias because I do believe of 100% in the entourage effect. And as far as I know, and the experience that I have, I've seen that when the patients are using full spectrum, in cases of epilepsy, has to be CBD rich, very little amounts of THC, which are shown in the studies that I showed you before. The doses that the patient has to use are less, and the response is better, and the side effects are less even when you're using the full spectrum. And I think it's a lot of that related with the doses. When you're using isolates, you have to use very high doses of CBD in order to achieve the result. So I do think that this is regarding to we have this robust scientific evidence with isolates. In other ways, we have a lot of other different evidence from the perspective that when the patient use the full spectrum, they have an entourage effect that is definitely a very important effect. And the benefits of the rest of the cannabinoids, of the terpenes, and of the flavonoids are really, really something that we all need to consider. And in the isolate, we don't have terpenoids, we don't have flavonoids, we don't have the rest of cannabinoids. So it's a situation where I think as a scientist, for the way we have to study and produce scientific evidence, when you use isolates, are important to produce these studies. But in the practice, the full spectrum CBD reach shown very, very important outcomes.
Okay, Dr. Sandra, thank you so much for your time and for answering all these questions and for a great presentation. We really hope to have you again in the future, and so you can bring your knowledge and your information to Portugal and the rest of the world.
Thank you so much, Laura, and thank you to everybody, and stay safe.
You too, Sandra. Thank you and see you soon.
See you soon. Bye.
Bye. Thank you all so much for watching this first edition of PTMC Talks. We hope to see you again in the future. In the meantime, you can subscribe our news on our website on www.ptmc.pt. Stay safe and hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.